Hey guys, this evening I'm going to be talking about Lazarus in John chapter 11 and Jairus' daughter in Matthew chapter 9, as well as a few other topics as we go through Jesus' use of sleeping as a metaphor or a euphemism for death, and kind of what the differences in these two situations are. So here's the outline of the points that I will be going over here. So first, we're going to kind of start with some questions that I got from a person I know. It kind of sparked my research into this topic. And then we're going to kind of go through those point by point. First, we're going to talk about how the Lazarus of Luke chapter 16. So this is the story with Lazarus and the rich man and Abraham is not actually the same as the Lazarus who Jesus raises from the dead in John chapter 11. Then we're going to be talking about how when Jesus describes Lazarus as sleeping in John 11, he is using a euphemism there. That is, he's kind of, rather than coming right out and saying he's dead, he's using a turn of speech kind of similar to how we would say someone has passed away or is no longer with us or something. And then in Matthew chapter 9, when Jesus says that Jairus' daughter is sleeping, I'm going to argue that it's actually a little bit different. He's not using it quite so euphemistically in this case, but he has a little bit more of a different purpose there. And we'll get to that once we get to this part of the video today. And then finally, I'm going to be talking about Hebrews 9:27, which talks about how it is appointed once for man to die, and after that comes the judgment. And so, well, in these cases where Lazarus and Jairus' daughter were raised from the dead, and there are some other examples in the Bible too. Well, what of this when we think about it is appointed once for man to die? Well, aren't these people dying twice? So we're going to kind of examine that question as it pertains to all of this as well. So first off, we're going to be going over the questions that my friend had. So Hebrews 9:27, as we just talked about at the end of that intro bit there, says that each person is destined to die once, and after that comes judgment. But in John chapter 11, verse 11, Jesus tells his disciples that Lazarus is sleeping. But then when they say, well, then he'll soon get better, as people sleep when they get sick do, Jesus then actually clarifies that he's dead. So that's verse 13 that says that that's what Jesus meant. Also in Matthew chapter 9, verse 24, Jesus says that the girl who is Jairus' daughter, if you compare it in the other synoptic gospels, isn't dead, but she's only asleep. But in this case, he actually doesn't further clarify. Like, no one asks him, and he doesn't insist that she's dead. And so this is actually probably the more complicated of the two, as we'll get to. But the question that my friend had here was, well, why does he say that they're sleeping instead of just saying that they're dead? And why does he clarify that Lazarus is dead, but not the girl? So why is there a difference there in his actions? And then also was asked here in Luke chapter 16, when Jesus tells about the rich man and Lazarus, he doesn't mention sleeping at all. He says that they died. And so there is a man named Lazarus in Luke chapter 16, and there's a man named Lazarus in John chapter 11. And so I'm going to be arguing when we get there in a sec that those actually aren't the same person. And so that's kind of how we handle this one. And then finally, I'm just going to talk a little bit, this idea in Hebrews chapter 9 that, well, when people die, they die once. Doesn't that kind of go against the idea that they're sleeping here? So, that both of these passages, Lazarus in John chapter 11 and Jairus' daughter in Matthew chapter 9, kind of the passages we're going to be looking at this evening as we consider this question here. So I'm going to kind of split the response here down point by point, kind of a lot to unpack. So there's some good questions, in fact, quite a few of them here, but they're kind of on different tracks. And so I'm going to try to tackle it section by section here, piece by piece. So this did get kind of long, but hopefully I will manage to hit all of the questions that we just went over there. So first thing that I'm going to be starting with is that the Lazarus of Luke 16 is not the same as the Lazarus of John chapter 11. Just like today, in antiquity, plenty of people shared names. So it is that we have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, among all the other Marys mentioned in the New Testament, of which there are several others. John the Baptist, the son of Elizabeth and Zechariah, and John, the brother of James, who was one of the 12 apostles. And then James, the brother of Jesus, he's the one who wrote the book of James. Also, James, the brother of John, who was also one of the 12 apostles alongside his brother. And James, the son of Alphaeus, who's yet another of the 12 apostles. So 2 of the 12 apostles were named James, and then Jesus' brother was also named James. One might go on. These are not the only examples of people sharing names in the New Testament. But the point here is, just like today, it was not all that uncommon for different people to have the same name. This means things can get confusing rather quickly. And so kind of the upshot of this is that while it's completely reasonable to line up the 2 people named Lazarus, the shared name alone is not proof of them being the same person. In fact, we kind of have some evidence to the contrary. In John 12, verse 3, we are told that Lazarus' sister Mary anointed Jesus' feet with nard, an expensive type of perfume. Additionally, John chapter 11, verse 19 says that many Jews came to comfort the sisters, that is Mary and Martha, in the loss of their brother. From these verses and others, it's apparent that Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were relatively affluent and well-connected. But the Lazarus of Luke chapter 16, in the story with the rich man and Abraham, well, he's a beggar, perhaps the lowest social station possible. So quite simply, from the Bible itself, it seems unlikely that these 2 men are the same person. And that's, again, kind of just because of all the context clues we have in John chapter 11, John chapter 12, and everywhere else that Mary and Martha and Lazarus are mentioned. They kind of seem to present as coming from a relatively wealthy and well-connected family in Jewish society. But the beggar of John chapter 16, or sorry, of Luke chapter 16, just doesn't seem to fit that mold. And so among other things, the beggar of Luke chapter 16, we have no mention of sisters there either. And it's apparent that the siblings were rather close. So, that's kind of another lacking point in context in favor of viewing the 2 Lazaruses as being 2 different men. So before we close out, that is what I think on this subject. Just also say here that some people actually think that the account of Abraham and Lazarus in Luke chapter 16 is just a parable rather than recounting something that actually happened. It's a little bit tangential, but I actually believe this to be decidedly wrong, as we're given no indication that this is merely a parable. As if Jesus was just using this as an illustration, but it wasn't actually, something that was like a historical reality or something that actually happened. Here's what my mentor has to say on the subject. So this is from ichthys.com, which is an online Bible teaching ministry. But he says that Jesus most certainly does not say that it is a parable, although that's his practice when engaging in parables. Also, what other parable of our Lord's can you cite where historical people with definite names are employed? When Jesus is using a parable, the Gospels generally say so. On the other hand, parables do not attribute definite historical actions to definite and precise historical people whom we know from elsewhere in the Bible as having done things they actually did not do. So that would kind of be Abraham in this example. Abraham obviously is someone who we know quite a bit about from the Old Testament, but if you were to argue that this is just a parable, you'd have to be arguing that Jesus was using Abraham, who was a real historical figure and whom we have a good bit of information about, to illustrate a point that wasn't actually true. It just kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. And then finally, even if you were to argue that this was just a parable, you'd still have to kind of take this to mean that the circumstances of the parable could not and would not teach theological error. And so this kind of comes up when talking about a false teaching called soul sleep, which is kind of the idea that when people die, they kind of go to sleep until resurrection day, like they cease to have conscious existence. So we're not going to get into that in our video tonight because it's kind of off topic for what we're talking about. But that's kind of why, even if you argue that this was just a parable, it kind of doesn't get you out of the theological implications of what is being talked about here. So next, we're going to be talking about when Jesus describes Lazarus as sleeping in John chapter 11. It's very clear from John chapter 11 that Lazarus was dead. Unlike in the Matthew chapter 9 passage, which we'll get to in a moment, there can be absolutely no doubt whatsoever on the part of anyone. This is because in John chapter 11, verse 17, we hear that Lazarus had already been entombed for 4 days before Jesus arrived in Bethany, where Mary and Martha and Lazarus live. So why then did Jesus employ the language of sleeping instead of death? Quite simply, the explanation here is that he was just speaking euphemistically. We still do this nowadays as well. For example, in English, we might say someone passed away or is no longer with us or went to be with Jesus rather than bluntly saying that they died. But in all of these things, we kind of clearly get that the thing being spoken of is death. Here's another on-topic quote from my mentor who I mentioned before. So he's sort of starting out in his response here, addressing a question about that false doctrine I mentioned before called soul sleep. And he says that a major part of the issue and why people have kind of gotten this false idea in the past is because of this euphemism sleep for those who have died. Now, in terms of what exactly euphemisms are, a euphemism is a circumlocution or a certain phraseology that is more pleasant or less offensive than giving something its most direct and abrupt name. And so this is why a veterinarian might say to you, I'm sorry to have to tell you that your cat has passed, instead of saying straight out, your cat is dead. And if we humans kind of feel compunctions about being too direct in the case of the death of someone's pet, well, how much more inappropriate would it be for us to say if someone's family member straight out, he's dead, as if, in the most shocking way possible, rather than trying to be gentle for the sake of those who are left behind. And in fact, the use of euphemism is something that is also present other places in Scripture. So we would say that it's part of inspiration. If we believe the Bible is true and inspired by the Holy Spirit, then the fact that the writers of the Bible use euphemism is something that is inspired by the Spirit. So, for example, there's sort of avoidance of direct terms for sexual and other biological functions in the Pentateuch. So those are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And then in terms of death, on point to our current discussion topic, Jesus uses this euphemism in John chapter 11, which is kind of what we're talking about in context here. And so sort of the point here is that when people in the Bible say that he or she is asleep, they often mean that that person is dead, without there being any conclusion to be drawn from the nature of the euphemism about the current state of the individual, since we can't really tell, if someone has died, whether they have gone to heaven or to hell to await judgment, because, obviously we can't see into human hearts. Now, the problem in this is that in English, we really don't use the same idiom. And so this is something that kind of varies across cultures and languages. So death is something that is very commonly euphemistically spoken of. So it is something that's common for people to not say quite so straight out. So we have plenty of euphemisms for death in English. I mentioned several before, but they're not the same as in Hebrew here. So we really don't have in our common practice saying that someone is dead is asleep. It's just not something that we have culturally. In fact, in our cultural view, you could kind of see how some people might think that using this particular euphemism might seem kind of cruel rather than kind, because it might seem to imply that someone could just be awakened when in fact, if they're actually dead, viewing things from a secular and materialistic perspective at any rate, that wouldn't be the case. They would be actually gone. So that sort of sense of false hope here might seem to even be kind of cruel. But in the context of our story here, and more to the point in the Hebrew idiom and kind of the ties it has with their views of the resurrection from the dead, we kind of do see the superiority of the biblical idiom for death here. Because when Jesus says he's going to wake up Lazarus, he actually does so. And so this was a miracle, obviously, that has rarely been repeated in the history of the world, because obviously, it's not like people just go around raising others from the dead on a regular basis. But it does show that behind the word sleep used in the biblical euphemism for death, there does lie the possibility of awakening, not of this physical body in its corrupt state, that is aside from these uncommon miracles, as in the case of Lazarus, but of the body transformed in resurrection at the return of Jesus Christ. So we would think of passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 15 in this. And so we actually get this directly in the passage when you consider Martha's word to Jesus. I know he being Lazarus, will rise again in the resurrection at the last day, in response to when Jesus had said, your brother will rise again. But diving into the Greek vocabulary here for just a second, the verb here, anistemi, while it is the standard word for resurrection used in the New Testament, is actually also the standard word for getting up and waking up from sleep. So kind of to pull it all together, whether we're talking about genuine sleep or miraculous resuscitation of the body, as with Lazarus, or the actual resurrection and transformation of the body that will happen at our Lord's return, in all of these cases, we have quote unquote sleep followed by rising. And kind of what we mean by that is that it's unquestionably the body which sleeps and then rises. But when we die, we kind of become out of this body and we go face to face with the Lord. So this body meaning like our present mortal bodies that we have in this life. And so I'll kind of turn back to this a little bit later in our video tonight, but basically the takeaway here is that the euphemism of sleep for death is clearly and entirely directed at the body, not the spirit. And so a lot of versions sometimes translate soul here. And so that's translating a Hebrew word, nephesh, and the Greek word is psyche. And the soul is, biblically speaking, what that word means in Greek and Hebrew is kind of the combination of our bodies and our spirits. So the spirit's given by God at the point of birth for us as humans, and together those things compose the soul. So just taking a step back, as I say, the takeaway here is that sleep is getting at the physical sense of death rather than sort of what we'd call the spiritual or eternal sense of it. And so kind of to pull us a little bit back more into John chapter 11, because we in our culture do not use sleep as a euphemism for death in the same way that the Hebrew culture did, at least at the time that Christ was around, it can kind of be harder for us to pick up on this when we read English translations and kind of look at the situation from the quote-unquote English worldview. But in fact, to properly grasp the meaning of the Bible, sometimes we must endeavor to put ourselves in the shoes of a first century Hebrew-speaking person from Judea, just for example. That's kind of us in this situation in John 11, and then read the Bible from that perspective rather than our own perspective. You may sort of sometimes hear this term, quote-unquote, culture-sensitive interpretation, or something along those lines. And in this, it's not that the truth ever really changes or anything like that. It's simply that we must do our homework when it comes to interpreting the Bible according to the audience to whom it was written. Like, we need to care about that. It's part of doing interpretation correctly. And when we do that, hopefully it kind of becomes clear why Jesus's words here are no contradiction. For we can see from John chapter 11, verse 13, that Jesus actually did mean that Lazarus was dead when he said he was sleeping. In fact, if you look at this verse, that is very much what it says, almost like word for word, literally. Jesus had spoken of his death. The only thing that Jesus said before this verse in John 11 was that Lazarus was asleep. And then all the apostles were like, well, he'll wake up, he'll be fine. But Jesus had actually meant in that, as this verse says, that Lazarus was dead. So that's how he was using the word. It's very clear. John chapter 11, verse 13, you can't get out of it, says that Jesus used it as a euphemism. That's what this verse kind of forces us to say. And so we've just gone through, that is kind of what Jesus meant when he used sleeping here in John chapter 11. Just this verse and everything we've gone through here helps us understand that in this particular passage, Jesus was using sleeping as a euphemism for death. All right, so now we're going to be talking about Jairus' daughter in Matthew chapter 9. This passage actually appears across all the synoptic gospels, so that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it can kind of often be helpful to read all the gospels in parallel for these parallel passages to see how the same events are described by the different writers. Now, we can kind of actually limit ourselves to Matthew here, since kind of with respect to the question that we're addressing of why Jesus said the girl was sleeping, that detail is pretty consistent across all three accounts. So we'll just limit ourselves to looking at the Matthew account. I just thought I'd mention the fact that it is a good habit to get into of comparing parallel passages when we study the Gospels. So first of all, we're going to talk about some of the context here. So the people in the crowd that was at Jairus's house when Jesus got there were, in all likelihood, sort of professional mourners. That concept may seem a little bit foreign to us in our time, like you pay people to go do the mourning rituals that are part of, the funeral rites of your culture. But it's kind of similar in our day to maybe hiring a pianist to play hymns at a loved one's funeral or something like that. The people whose job it is to kind of provide music at the event or set the atmosphere and things like that. Now, kind of why I'm bringing this up is because the people here were, to put it somewhat crudely, there for money. They were kind of there to get paid. It was their job. And so they would have been hired to perform the culturally expected funerary proceedings. So if someone dies, this is the steps that their culture takes to have a funeral in an orderly manner. These are just sort of the things that are expected. But because they're kind of paid help, it does kind of explain why a lack of decorum on their part probably ought not shock us, as if they were family members of the person deceased. Sort of sad as that is to say. That is, you kind of want people to be respectful at funerals, have some respect for the dead and things like that. But because they might be people just being paid, that is why it ought not shock us if we don't see that respect from them. And so this is kind of why these people mock Jesus's statement in Matthew chapter 9, verse 24, when he says that the girl's not dead, but just sleeping. So obviously mocking Jesus and under this set of circumstances is kind of disrespectful. But these people aren't necessarily the family here. They would be people who were hired for the funeral rites. And so that's kind of why, in context, these are the people mocking Jesus. Not so much Jairus, who went to get Jesus out of faith, trusting that Jesus could actually heal his daughter, but the people who would be present there at the home who were not part of the family. And so those people, they kind of might be thinking something along these lines. Now, I should say we don't have anything in the Bible like this. I'm just sort of trying to get us to think about what might have been going through these people's heads. So they might be thinking something like this. We were just hired to do the funeral things for this girl, and now this joker shows up and says she's not even dead, but only asleep. Please, mister, give me a break. Just let us go back to work so we can collect our payment. Right. So if I was one of these people who'd been paid to do these things, and then someone shows up and says, "Oh, hold on, we're canceling this. She's not even dead." When everyone thinks she's dead, the parents hired these people because she's dead. People would obviously be skeptical, and the response that Jesus gets is kind of conditioned on account of these things. And so kind of the point of going through all this is just to sort of set the scene here for this passage in Matthew. This is kind of what's going on when Jesus arrives at Jairus's house, having been taken there, told that his daughter is either dead or on the point of death. Jesus is arriving to this set of circumstances. All right, so having kind of set the scene here, we're going to be talking now about how Jesus actually isn't using sleeping as a euphemism this time, but he's kind of doing something completely different with it. So because we argued there that Jesus was definitely using it as a euphemism in John chapter 11, it can be kind of tempting to think that maybe we should just do the same thing here. But there are kind of some issues with doing that. Now, first, as my friend pointed out, Jesus never clarifies to say that the girl was in fact dead. So that would have been a really natural thing for him to do when the crowd began to mock him in Matthew chapter 9, verse 24. So after all, if he really did mean in saying that the girl was sleeping, that she was dead, why would he hide it then? Why would he not say, no, really, like when they think they're laughing at him for saying that, because they think he's saying, like she's asleep as in not dead, why wouldn't he set the record straight with them if that's actually what he meant? So that's kind of one reason against this. But then sort of the second thing is that we can note that Jesus actually shoos the people away. He kicks the crowd out of the house and makes them wait outside. And so if there were nothing else going on here in this situation, and he were just merely speaking euphemistically, and he was actually planning on raising her from the dead and being kind of open about it, then why would he do this? Why would he kick the people out? And then so it's really natural to ask, well, if he's not doing that, and that's, so far that's what we've talked about when Jesus uses the word sleeping in the context of death. Well, if he's not doing that, well, what is he doing? What is going on here then? So, in my opinion, the best way to interpret this passage in Matthew chapter 9 and in the other parallel passages in the other synoptic gospels that are talking about the same thing is that Jesus knew full well that Jairus' daughter was dead, but yet he said that she was sleeping and very intentionally never clarified whether it was a euphemism or not. Like it's not just something that the gospel writers just omitted or something. He actually never did clarify. So culturally, kind of as we argued in the John chapter 11 section of this video, we did say that this was a euphemism in common use in their culture. Even if it's not in ours, this was something that people of the time would understand. But even so, people here would still have wondered if he was being literal, as in she's actually asleep, not dead, especially when the girl comes walking out of the house in relatively short order here. When Jesus said this, it was a euphemism. People could interpret it as meaning that she was dead, but they could also interpret it as meaning she was alive. So the sort of two reasons for why I think Jesus would do this, that is, saying this, which some people could take to be a euphemism for death, but some people could also take literally. And then two reasons why he wouldn't clarify to sort of set the record straight about what was actually happening. So the first reason would be kind of for his own sake specifically. So whenever Jesus did miracles, those miracles drew immense crowds. I mean, and especially for the time, thousands of people back then. I mean, we have thousands of people nowadays regularly at concerts and so on, but back then, this many people was immense, and the amount of pressure that puts, or just, Jesus not being able to get alone to pray and things like that. All these people drawn in by the shiny things and the spectacle of it all. So the pyrotechnics, if you will, of Jesus's miracles. They didn't care about what he had to say so much as that they wanted to see these miraculous things, the signs and wonders. Well, these people would make it really hard for Jesus to accomplish his ministry. So God the Father sent Jesus into the world in the incarnation for a specific purpose, culminating in the cross where he paid for the sins of us all. And so he had a mission. And having all of these people follow him around because they wanted to see him do wondrous things kind of gets in the way of that mission. And so we can kind of see this phenomenon pretty clearly in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up and then read it. So in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 through 45, it says this: "And a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him, and saying, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, and said to him, 'I am willing, be cleansed.' Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. And he sternly warned him and immediately sent him away. And he said to him, 'See that you say nothing to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded as a testimony to them.' But he, being the leper, went out and began to proclaim it freely and to spread the news around to such an extent that Jesus could no longer publicly enter a city, but stayed out in unpopulated areas, and they were coming to him from everywhere." So sort of the point of bringing this up is that you can see that whenever Jesus did miracles and people spread the fame of these miracles, it made it hard for him to move about or just do anything, to be honest, because he had all these people excited in the spectacle of it. And there are some other passages here too. I quoted a couple just right after this in Matthew chapter 9. Actually, Jesus heals some blind men and then tells them to not spread it about. And then another case in Matthew chapter 12 when he's healing people. But the basic idea here is that Jesus, as a general rule, wanted to keep his miracles veiled and something that was decidedly less than shouted from the rooftops. And that's to avoid the celebrity of it all, since it interfered with the plan that God the Father had for him in carrying out his ministry here in the world. And so we kind of just talked about maybe why Jesus would want to avoid the fame and the spectacle of this. But even aside from his own celebrity, consider for a moment the life that this poor girl would lead if Jesus raised her from the dead in an unambiguous sort of way in front of a large crowd of people. So, himself aside, it's quite likely that Jesus avoided doing this to spare her and her family the sheer amount of interference this would cause in the rest of their lives. And so you can kind of compare famous people today who have stalkers and they have fans, and they can never go anywhere without having large groups of people accost them. Well, imagine if you were the person who everyone saw with their own eyes get raised from the dead. Now, of course, this happened with Lazarus. We'll get there in a second. But for a young girl in that time and place, that sort of pressure and attention was something that you can kind of see why Jesus would want to spare her from that, and her family. It wouldn't just be her; it'd be the entire family would have all these people come and say, "Well, are you the people who Jesus raised from the dead? Like what happened? Show us, talk to us, tell us about it." For months or years or even her entire life, she might face that sort of thing. And so you can kind of see that you could make an argument here that Jesus would want to have that outcome avoided for this family. He wouldn't want to put them in the spotlight due to all the negative pressure that comes with that. And I'll get to this when we talk about Lazarus, but it's not just the interfering busybodies, if you will. The Pharisees, to attempt to stamp out the credibility of Jesus, actually considered putting to death the people that he raised from the dead. Because if Jesus raised him from the dead and people believe in him because of it, well, then one solution to that problem from the Pharisees' perspective is to kill the people that he raised from the dead and say, well, you see, he's not actually raised from the dead. And so Jesus would want to spare the young girl and her family from this. And so just to elaborate on this idea a little bit more, if Jesus insisted that she was sleeping, sends everyone out like he did, and then she appears a few minutes later, rumors sort of take over and do the rest of the work here. So no doubt the girl and her family, even in this case, would receive some attention if people thought that Jesus had miraculously healed her from very serious illness. But on the other hand, Jesus did do that reasonably often with plenty of other people too. Like this would not be the only time that, he kind of, miraculously healed someone that was on the brink of death or very serious ailment. He made the blind see, for example. So she would hardly be unique in this capacity. So in this case, after a while, the nosiness of others would die down. They'd probably forget about her as Jesus, healed the next person. And then the family could live in peace. But if Jesus unambiguously raised her from the dead in front of everyone, well, that's a wee bit more of a thing. People would remember that. That would have this huge impact. And so just to highlight this point a bit, there's actually only two other instances of Jesus raising people from the dead in Scripture, aside from this passage here, which is Jairus' daughter. One we've already talked about. That's the raising of Lazarus in John chapter 11. The other is the widow of Nain's son in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. Now, based on the argument that I've been making here, one could kind of fairly ask if Jesus might wish to avoid fame for himself and others as a matter of practicality, as I've just been arguing for, well, why did Jesus not try to play off these two instances as well? That is, imply in some way that he was not actually raising these people from the dead. So that is Lazarus in John chapter 11 and the widow of Nain's son in Luke chapter 7. And so kind of a couple points here. In the case of the widow of Nain's son in Luke chapter 7, well, Jesus actually raised him from the dead during the funeral procession. Like touch the coffin and he comes out. You kind of don't have a lot of plausible deniability there, right? And so in the Matthew chapter 9 passage, Jesus actually sends them all out of the house, and then he makes the girl come to life. And so, there's this sense that well, was she actually really dead? Because people who weren't in there, that's where the rumors start to spread. There's this sense of no one can refute it or contradict it, but not so much when you take the guy out of the coffin in the funeral procession. And this is true of Lazarus as well, who, as we kind of already mentioned when we were talking about his case in John 11, well, he'd already been in the tomb for 4 days before Jesus even got to Bethany. And so, one obvious reason why Jesus didn't do some of this they're only sleeping business and sort of try to downplay the celebrity and the fame and the spectacle here is because in these cases, it just simply wouldn't be possible to do that. But even aside from that, there's actually another thing here as well. And that's the fact that both of these people were adult men. And so even with interfering busybodies or worse, bothering them on account of the miracle, they would be capable of warding off anything problematic from them and their families. And so I kind of hinted at this earlier. In John chapter 12, verse 10, the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also because of the people who were believing because of him. So Jesus raises him from the dead, and then people, based on the witness of that miracle, believe that he's the Son of God, that he has the authority over life and death. And then the Pharisees, well, they don't like this, right? He's not conforming to their power structure. They want to get rid of him. And one way to get rid of his influence is to just kill Lazarus. Because if all these people say, well, Lazarus, who was sick and died, we know he died. Well, if he's actually dead, then suddenly you can, quote unquote, disprove the miracle, right? At least that's how the Pharisees would see it. And so we don't have anything else mentioned in this in Scripture. We do know that Jesus was close to Lazarus and his sisters. He openly wept when Lazarus died, and Mary and Martha show up elsewhere in the Bible. This was a family whom Jesus loved, who were kind of close to him. But Lazarus would get flack from this. And again, we don't know a great deal more about this in the Bible, like what happened. Were they successful in putting him to death eventually? We really don't know. But the point is that he would have heat and pressure from the Pharisees and the other leaders of the Jews at this point who resented the authority that Jesus had and that people were following him because of this. And so Lazarus, as an adult man, he could kind of handle this. But the point here in context is that a young girl who was raised from the dead, throwing her into that den of vipers, if you will, is a completely different thing. And I should just note here that this is especially true given the relatively higher degree of vulnerability women were forced to contend with in antiquity. And so nowadays, there is not perhaps quite so much, I would still argue that this is true, but in antiquity, when someone like this, a woman in their society, especially a young woman, we don't know exactly how young Jairus' daughter was, but not old, the amount of power that she would have to fight against things like this would be very limited relative to these men that Jesus raised from the dead. And so these two things kind of together, this is kind of why we're arguing, well, Jesus might try to minimize the fame and the amount that this miracle spreads here in Matthew chapter 9, but that doesn't contradict these other cases because there's these other factors in play as well. Now, I'll kind of close this part out by acknowledging that a lot of what I've just said here is based on inference and degree of speculation on my part. So it's not as if the Bible actually directly says these things very explicitly. But I actually do believe that this is more than just an opinion. So there are certain matters of Scripture where we kind of say, well, it could be this, it could be this. This is just what I think, but other people who think something different, well, we're just kind of taking position on something we can't be sure on. I'm actually pretty black and white on this, even though I think we get there a bit indirectly. And that's because I see little other explanation that satisfies all the elements in this passage in Matthew chapter 9 without having other problems at the same time. And so one bit that causes a special trouble for people is Jesus sending the people out. Most other interpretations don't really have a good reason for that. Like why wouldn't Jesus just raise her like he did Lazarus and the other man in front of witnesses? Like why would he do those that way, but this one is different? That's why I say this point of view that I've articulated, I think is the only one that really captures it all, that explains it all and makes good sense, because other interpretations do exist for this. It's just that I don't think they reconcile all the evidence and they kind of wave their hand at the things that don't fit in a way that I don't think is proper for us when we do try to interpret the Bible as the inspired word of God. Now, I should also say that some people might be offended at the line of thinking that I've suggested here because, they would say that it suggests that Jesus intentionally misdirected the beliefs of others. So if you were being uncharitable, you would call this lying. And I don't want to get off on a big tangent here, but I would ask these people what they think of the Hebrew midwives in Exodus chapter 1, verses 15 through 22, as well as Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. So in the Exodus passage, which, you can read it, but I'm just going to summarize it here. The Hebrew midwives were, ordered to search the children and then kill, basically report to Pharaoh for the ones, and they didn't do it. They saved the children. They disobeyed a direct order, and they lied to Pharaoh's face basically about it. Hebrew children are, I don't want to butcher the paraphrase here, but like basically put to death the sons. And, the Hebrew midwives are like, well, they give birth so fast, we can't get there in time. And this is not true. But God commends them for it. They're blessed. They're given families of their own on account of what they do, the actions they take here. They could be put to death by Pharaoh for this, right? But it is most certainly a lie. You can't get out of it in that situation. And in Joshua chapter 2, when Rahab is hiding the Hebrew spies, when they are going to take Jericho, she, again, direct lie. She's praised for it in the New Testament in Hebrews chapter 11 and James chapter 2. So Hebrews 11:31 and James chapter 2, verse 25. And people do try to argue against what I'm saying here. They try to explain it all away somehow. But the clearest sense is that actually in both of these cases, the people in question are praised for the actions they took, i.e. being dishonest to someone. Now, this will no doubt ruffle feathers. I'm quite sure people will not like this. But my contention is that part of growing up spiritually is learning to distinguish actual moral virtue from legalistic rules that have the appearance of holiness, but are in fact compatible with true righteousness. And so the point here is that, if you want to say, well, Jesus shouldn't have said she was sleeping, she should have just said he was dead and then raised her from the dead in front of everyone. Well, what say you then to the harm that could befall that family? And if Jesus couldn't do his ministry after that because of all these people following him around in this case, is that actually what is right? You might also compare the idea of Sabbath observance in the New Testament. So what is the actual sense behind the law? What is the law? What purpose does it serve? That sort of thinking is kind of what I'm trying to get at here. And so I don't think we need to be concerned about this, because if there was ever one person in the history of the world who was capable of discerning what is actually righteous from that which is not, it's going to be Jesus, right? Now, I am not the only person in the world who thinks what I put forth. My mentor, who I've already quoted from several times, he has some stuff up on this, so I'll just show you. If you click these links, this is kind of cool. If you use a Chromium browser, I think some other browsers may implement the same specification. It will actually take you directly to the text on the page. You can link to specific paragraphs and stuff. So he has a couple questions and answers things up on the site that talk about this, the same thing about trying to preserve out of consideration for the girl and her family, lest they get all this fame and they become targets because of it. He thinks the same thing in this regard. So two links there talking about similar things. Now, if you don't use a browser like that, like maybe Safari or something, you can still search for the word sleep on those pages and you'll find those sections as well. Okay, that finally brings us to Hebrews 9:27. So we've kind of gone over Lazarus now. We've gone over Jairus' daughter, and now we're getting to this verse in Hebrews chapter 9. And so the question is kind of this. If Hebrews 9:27 says that it is appointed for man to die once, and after that, judgment, well then, what about Lazarus and Jairus' daughter? Aren't they dying twice, not once? And I will say, it's not just these two. It gets even worse than this. So there's this passage in Matthew chapter 27 that talks about when Jesus was on the cross, he cried out, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, the earth shook, the rocks were split, and then the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep came out, and many people saw them, right? So all these people came out from the grave, and they were about, people, here, I'll actually go show the passage here. They appeared to many. By all accounts, these were people who had been dead. They came out of their tombs and they were walking around Jerusalem. And so this isn't just like a person or two. There's a group of people there. But even more than that, an even more striking example, I don't want to get off topic here, but if you take the two witnesses of Revelation, and so you can see this in Revelation chapter 11 here. I'm not going to get too far into this, but the two witnesses, God will grant them authority. They will prophesy for 1,260 days. All these things happen. Well, these people, you can make a pretty strong case for these two actually being Moses and Elijah. And so there's a good reason for this, although that's ultimately kind of a topic for a different time, so I'm not really going to get into it here. But when these guys go around smiting bad guys with style, calling down plagues and fire and things like that. Well, this will be like a few thousand years after Moses and Elijah had last walked the earth, some thousands of years BC. Um, and yet they're certainly said to be dead after the beast kills them in Revelation 11 chapter 11 verse 7. The beast, overcame them and killed them. So what gives, right? If I'm saying that these people are Moses and Moses and Elijah died thousands of years ago, yet they are going to be walking around in the end times smiting bad guys, how does that work? Like, how does that not mean that they are dying twice, right? And so doesn't that mean that they're contradicting Hebrews chapter 9 as well? So not just Lazarus, not just Jairus' daughter, there's all these other examples in the Bible too. So I said it gets worse. So if you're troubled by this question, it's a good question. It's something that's fair for us to ask. How does this work? So we'll see kind of how convincing you find this, but in my opinion, the best way to answer this in the short way is at least saying that there's death and then there's death. So biblically speaking, there's kind of a difference between resuscitation, as was the case for Lazarus and Jairus' daughter, and all the other examples we mentioned above, even the two witnesses. So if you remember back to the Old Testament, Elijah actually rode a chariot up to heaven. He didn't die physically in the way most people do. And there's actually this other interesting passage that talk about kind of a scuffle between elect angels and fallen angels over Moses's body. Well, why did they need to get Moses's body? These are some of the reasons why we make these identifications of Moses and Elijah, but their physical bodies are going to be brought back to life, like the bodies that they had back then. Lazarus didn't get a new body when Jesus called him out of the grave. Same thing with Jairus' daughter. Well, that's different here than resurrection in the manner of 1 Corinthians 15. Like the trumpet sounds, the dead will rise. That passage is resurrection proper. Dead people are resuscitated. Dead people are resurrected, right? And so it maybe seems a little bit hand wavy here, but resuscitation and resurrection is the answer to this question here in Hebrews chapter 9. And kind of just to emphasize here, it's the eternal bodies bit that's the big difference here. So when someone is resuscitated, they are put back in their mortal body where they were to begin with, right? They don't have a new body like Jesus did after his resurrection, where they can like go through walls and fly and that sort of thing. They still have their bodies just like they were when they were alive before. So I'm sure that all sounds kind of hand wavy. Unfortunately, I don't want to spend too much time over this. I'm just trying to give the short answer here. But there it is. So put simply, all those who are resuscitated are not dead in the eternal sense of never again walking the earth in mortal bodies of fleshly corruption. I don't know why I wrote it quite like that, but basically they're not going to have these mortal bodies that turn us against God. It's like Galatians 5, right? Our desires from the flesh are not spiritual. They're not going to have these bodies anymore. They will. Those who are resuscitated will have these bodies again, but those who are resurrected will not. And so the difference is here, for us as humans, we can't really tell. Dead people are dead people. We don't know if they're ever going to come back to life again or if they won't until the last day. But with God's perfect foreknowledge and foreordination of all things, only those whom he does not foreknow as being resuscitated are positionally dead in the sense of being in the state that they'll be in until judgment day. So word all that a little bit more simply, God knows who would be resuscitated. So when Lazarus died, it's not like God was like, oh, okay, Jesus is not going to get there for 3 days. I wonder what's going to happen. God is in complete control of all events in human history. This is part of what his foreknowledge and foreordination of all things means. So in the eyes of God, people who are resuscitated aren't actually dead in the eternal sense here. And that is, they are not positionally waiting for judgment because they have unfinished business back in the world, right? And so we could say in this way that the two types of dead, if you want to call it that, are actually pretty different here. And this is in the eyes of God, just to emphasize that, not for us as humans, because when Lazarus was dead, it's not like people around him saw, I don't know, like sparkly shimmers or something above him. It's like, oh, he's going to come back to life. There isn't a trace of it for us as humans. It is indistinguishable. We don't know if God will ever resuscitate someone. So there's other examples in the Bible. When a young man fell out of a window when Paul was teaching, Paul brings him back from the dead as well. But there's no way for the people at that time to know, well, that one, he's going to come back to life, and that one's not. Like there's no way. But God knows this, and that's what we're kind of emphasizing here. In this progression, I don't want to get off topic. In Hebrews chapter 9, the writer of Hebrews is kind of emphasizing this idea of the finality of once for all, right? Jesus doesn't have to be put to death over and over again because his one sacrifice was sufficient to pay for sin, unlike the temple sacrifices, which, again, more of a side tangent, but never had power themselves, but were just kind of foreshadowing Jesus's sacrifice. Well, he put our sin to death once for all on the cross. And so that's where this, it is appointed for man to die once sort of fits into that progression. But what we're talking about here, the death in context there is to be eternally in the position of right before judgment, right? And that's different than being in a state of resuscitation, even if we as human beings can't ever really tell the difference between them. So I'm not sure if that's completely convincing. I hope it is. But that's kind of the short answer here to, well, how can these people be resuscitated and yet not die twice? It's that they're not in this state of eternal waiting for judgment. Like they're not there yet, basically, because God foreknows that they're going to be returned to their mortal bodies for a time before they actually do die in that eternal sense. And so just to give you a little bit more background on this, I'm going to quote from my mentor site again here. Other people have asked this question before. It is a reasonably common one in apologetics. So someone asked Lazarus if he'd been raised from the dead twice, and how do you reconcile that with this verse here from Hebrews? So that's basically exactly what we're asking, right? So here's what my mentor had to say. So Lazarus's resurrection really was an unusual case, but it was not unprecedented. So Jesus also raised the widow's son. It's that passage from Luke chapter 7 we already talked about, as well as Jairus' daughter. It's Matthew chapter 9. And then Elijah and Elisha, so these are Old Testament prophets, you might compare the book of Kings, also have what I would call resuscitation to their credit. But Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27 was, of course, written in full knowledge of all these cases. There are no mistakes in the Bible. That's what we believe in terms of inspiration. And so when people receive back their dead raised to life again, this is quoting Hebrews chapter 11, verse 35, this sort of thing, in the book of Hebrews even, in the same book that Hebrews chapter 9 shows up, is not unprecedented. This idea of resuscitation, of people being returned back to their mortal bodies kind of after having left them, if you will, from the perspective of this world, well, it's there right in the book of Hebrews as well. And so where my mentor goes with this is that he says he would look at Hebrews 9:27 like this. It doesn't contradict these miracles, and it's not ignorant of them, because in all these cases, there is still a final physical death, right? So people might be resuscitated for a time, but in the end, mortality catches up with them all, just like all of us as humans. So for that reason, nothing can or ever could stand in the way of coming judgment that's kind of positionally imminent for us all, except for Christ being judged in our place. That's what saves us as Christians. That's what we put our faith in. And so the examples of those who were temporarily brought back to life, and that's what we're calling resuscitation here, a temporarily being brought back to life, physical life in the mortal body, that's different than resurrection, to be clear. These actually confirm Hebrews 9:27, because even those who benefited the most from this amazing miracle of resuscitation from the dead, even those people could not avoid the appointment we all have with a final ultimate end to the physical life in these corrupt bodies we now inhabit. Now, you may have heard it phrased like this, right? Being born is a death sentence. No one from Adam to the last human being that ever lives will avoid physical death. It is the lot of humanity. That is what Hebrews 9:27 says. We can't escape it because eventually we will die. And after that point, we will be waiting for judgment, right? God will pronounce judgment on what we do in this life. it just so happens that there's these folks like Jairus's daughter and Lazarus and some other people in the Bible who they have, kind of a blip in their radar before they get there, right? So they are taken out of this life and then they temporarily are not in their bodies, but then they get put back in their mortal bodies on their way to that final appointment to where they will be then positionally awaiting judgment, right? They die just like everyone else. They just kind of had this detour in the middle, if you will. And so the upshot for us is that only through the resurrection by virtue of our faith in Jesus Christ, who is the resurrection and the life, do we avoid that last judgment, which leads to the second death. That's sort of a poetic, metaphorical way for talking about hell. It is very literally the second death. And instead pass on to life eternal in Jesus Christ. So this is what we believe. This is what we have our faith in. All right, so kind of looking at another Q&A from Ichthus here. This one is on that passage I mentioned in Matthew chapter 27, verse 53, which is when, the veil is torn, Jesus lets out this cry, and then the dead rise in Jerusalem. So again, similar idea of these people who were very obviously in their tombs. There's no ambiguity for them coming out and being seen by people in Jerusalem. How do we reconcile that with Hebrews chapter 9, verse 27? How was it that these people had to die a second death, even though the Bible teaches that we die once? Same sort of question. I'll be, using a different verse to phrase the question here. So very similar to the last Q&A we just read, my mentor kind of handles it like this. The very few people that constitute an exception to the normal rule of, well, when you die, you stay dead, this really isn't even much of an exception even so, because after these people were resuscitated, eventually they fell into the same category as everyone else. And that means that eventually they faced a physical death from which there would be no more reprieve. Eventually they died and they stayed dead, in other words. And that is the real point of Hebrews 9:27. For every single person, there will come a point in time from which they leave this mortal realm, which I come up with a word that isn't so out there. They'll leave this mortal realm never to return. That's what Hebrews 9:27 says. And then once they've left, the next thing in line after that, if you will, in the narrative is the judgment for them. And so we will all die physically. We are all mortal. It's what it means to be human. That's what Hebrews 9:27 is saying. And so resuscitation is kind of neither here nor there for that. And so it's not so much about the physical death, but we're going to exit our mortal bodies once. People who are resuscitated, they haven't yet made that final leap. They haven't been, completely eternally severed from their mortal bodies because they come back in them. And so that's why there is no contradiction here. So we will face God's judgment after this. Either the judgment of the righteous, and so that's standing before the throne of God and receiving reward for what we do in the power of Christ, or the judgment of the unrighteous, so-called great white throne judgment, when people are sentenced to hell for their unbelief, not because of their sin, but because of their unbelief. And so that's why everything in this life depends upon what we think of Jesus Christ. And the point here is that for all humans, no one can do absolutely anything about this. Every single person will die, and we will all face the judgment that comes after this. That's what Hebrews 9:27 is. Everyone will have this point after which they die, they stay dead, they are severed from their mortal bodies until we face eternal judgment. And so just to use some more examples from scripture here, Elijah, again, this is in Book of Kings, I think it's 1 Kings maybe, brought back a widow's son as well, kind of similar to Jesus in Luke chapter 7. The Shunammite son whom Elisha brought back, Tabitha, is a person who Peter brought back in the New Testament. And then the boy who I mentioned who fell from the window in Ephesus, whom Paul brought back, well, all of those people were resuscitated in the same way, but all of them died again, just like Lazarus, just like Jairus' daughter, just like those people from this passage in Matthew chapter 27 that we're kind of talking about in this Q&A. All of these people, once they had been resuscitated, eventually they died physically again. And so the contrast here is that all of these people who went to live quote unquote normal lives after being resuscitated and then died again physically as it is appointed per Hebrews chapter 9 verse 27, well, that's very different than those people who are resurrected, because those people who are resurrected, their bodies are fundamentally different. They cannot die again. at least not in that sense. And so there's nothing to indicate in any of these cases that the physical earthly body of those who were resuscitated was changed in any way other than the miracle of resuscitation itself. That is, that they were dead, but now they're alive again. It's not like they were alive in different bodies. They have the same bodies. And so there's actually like another category of people here, not to get too far off topic, but there's Enoch, who's mentioned in the book of Genesis here, and then Elijah too, who I mentioned just rode that chariot on up to heaven. Well, those guys didn't actually die physically. They just went straight there. But then they're going to be resurrected and appear before the judgment seat of Christ just the same as everyone else. Right? So they didn't even face physical death in the same way that we do, kind of a special case here. But in the end, they're still going to stand before Christ on Judgment Day. Not in a negative sense, but to be evaluated, as we all will be as human beings. Finally, it's not like anything we've said rests on this point, but it's also true that the chronology of when we write this, the Gospels and Acts, and when Paul, well, actually, I take Paul to write Hebrews, not everyone agrees, but the writer of Hebrews puts this in Hebrews chapter 9, depending on when you date the book, quite likely that it postdates all the Gospels and Acts, which is where we have these accounts of resuscitation, is that actually probably past this point, there wasn't anyone else who had this done. I mean, it depends on how much you view modern day miracles and stuff, but it's another topic for a different time. But basically, it's true from this point forward in Scripture that really there weren't any other resuscitations. But I think we don't need to really care about that. The main point that we've already been going over here is that resuscitation is different than resurrection. All right, well, this was probably quite a bit longer than you were expecting, but I just wanted to be thorough, try to get to all facets of this. So I'm just going to recap kind of what we've gone over here in this video. So the initial questions we were asking about John chapter 11, Matthew chapter 9, Lazarus and Jairus's daughter. Well, are they dead or are they asleep? Why did Jesus talk about it like that? Why did he kind of confirm that Lazarus was dead, but he didn't confirm that Jairus' daughter was dead? He didn't explain it. Was this the same Lazarus as the Lazarus in Luke chapter 16? Does that contradict Lazarus being asleep versus being dead? So those were some of the questions we went. And so kind of in order of what we talked about, we kind of first went over that the Lazarus of Luke chapter 16 is not the same as the Lazarus of John chapter 11. There's some reasons for thinking that, because Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, they seem to have been from a relatively affluent, well-connected family near Jerusalem, whereas the Lazarus of Luke chapter 16 is a beggar among the lowest social classes that there is. And so just not seeming likely that those are the same person. Then we talked about Jesus describing Lazarus as sleeping in John 11, due to verse 13 more or less directly stating it. This has to be Jesus speaking euphemistically. That is what is meant in this passage. That's really the only way you can responsibly interpret it. And we talked about Jairus' daughter in Matthew chapter 9 being something kind of different than that. So in my interpretation, and again, it's not just an opinion so far as I would say, is that I think this is an actual interpretation, like I'm black and white on it, not that everyone will agree with me, is that Jesus did what he did with Jairus' daughter, said that she was just sleeping, sends out the whole crowd, all these people who would otherwise be witnesses, and then raises her from the dead. So she was actually dead, not sleeping, but he says that she was sleeping, sends the people out, and that's to protect both this young woman and her family from the attention, both from busybodies and even the rulers who would, not appreciate this person being a living proof of Jesus's power to do miracles. Just as they were threatening Lazarus, as we have in John chapter 12, verse 10, well, Jesus protects them from that, and he also tries not to draw attention to himself before his time. And that is, spoken of in other places. We went over one such passage, Mark chapter 1, verses 40 to 45, talks about that phenomenon. And finally, we talked about Hebrews 9:27, this idea of it's appointed once for man to die, and after that, the judgment. And well, what does that have to do with these folks who were resuscitated, who were, dead as in no longer breathing in the tomb, and then suddenly they come back to life in the bodies that they had before, not resurrected with new eternal bodies, but, resuscitated, coming back as they were before, but then living a life, but eventually facing that death that we all face as humans. So we talked about how there's a difference between resuscitation and resurrection, and how that explains that Hebrews 9:27 here, talking about when we face the end of our lives where we don't come back anymore. Even these folks who had that detour where they came back once, eventually they will die, and that will be it. And then they will face God. That's what Hebrews 9:27 is getting at. Every single person will face that point of time from which there is no more time in this mortal world. We run out of time. We are there positionally in eternity after that. That's what Hebrews 9:27 is getting at. And only by trusting in Jesus Christ can we be on the right side of that judgment. So I hope this was helpful. I hope this has answered most of the questions, and that's where we'll cut this one.